Hello there, my nasty hobbitses. Welcome. As always, I'm Judge Zed, aka Zacharias the Pious of House Lane, first of his name, former Lord of Givashidashir and Harbinger of Sass, Unholy Prince of the Sea of Ash, and Lord of the Game. And today that game is going to be... Let's see if it's... Here we go. I'm going to be defining one of the OSR's most hotly debated buzzwords here live on the air in TED Talk format. This is something new I'm going to be experimenting with. This is also going to be going up on YouTube. And yes, I want to talk about Gonzo. As some of you may already know, it's the 50th anniversary of Hunter S. Thompson having his Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas story published. And so Gonzo has kind of, it's a term I think, like Kafkaesque, has kind of taken on a life of its own. And so I want to do a quick talk about what I have come to understand it to mean, and how I would like to see us in the OSR community use the word going forward in a way that I think serves everyone a lot better. And then I'm going to be opening that conversation up to you, the viewers. I have a few other things I'm going to be talking about today, but this is first on the docket. So, what is Gonzo? I'm gonna do the most cliche thing, and I'm going to start this off by talking about just the sheer dictionary definition of the word Gonzo. Adjective, informal, North American. The first most commonly used definition is of or associated with a journalistic writing of an exaggerated, subjective, and fictionalized style. Also potentially meaning bizarre or crazy. With the example being the woman was either gonzo or stoned. The origin comes from the 1970s, perhaps from Italian, the word gonzo meaning foolish, or Spanish meaning the Spanish word gonzo, meaning goose or fool. So, foolish, fool, goose, later turned into meaning crazy, exaggerated, over the top, fictionalized, subjective. What does all this stuff mean? Let's break it down a little bit further. So the one who is Gonzo, the person who is the reason that the term Gonzo was originally created, is, as I've mentioned, Hunter S. Thompson. I'm using a quote here from an article I found very, very helpful in creating this video. The article is A Brain Full of Contraband, the Islamic Gonzo Writings of Michael Muhammad Knight. This was written by Brian J. Bowie of Grand Valley State University, United States of America. Interesting article in which taking a contemporary person whose writing is described as Gonzo, and Hunter S. Thompson's writing, who is described as Gonzo, and comparing the two in order to discover the most core sense of the word, what is Gonzo? And that is exactly what I'm going to be doing today as it relates to game design. So let's continue to move on here. I'll read you this quote here because it's very important moving forward. Gonzo journalism is a style of journalism that is written without claims of objectivity, often including the reporter as part of the story using first-person narrative. The word Gonzo is believed to have first been used in 1970 to describe an article about the Kentucky Derby by Hunter S. Thompson, who popularized the style. It is an energetic first-person participatory writing style in which the author is a protagonist. It draws its power from a combination of social critique and satire. Later on in this article, this is another quote. Based on the review of previously suggested meanings, a preliminary summary definition of Gonzo, posited here, is an energetic and iconoclastic first-person writing style in which the author has also adopted a performative role in the text. So these are very key things. Energetic first-person participatory performative role in the text. These are very key concepts for this whole talk moving forward. But if you're still not on board, if you don't know where I'm going with this yet, stay hydrated and buckle up. This is going to be a bumpy ride. Here we go. Oh, what have I done? Please? There we go. Here's an example. The Kentucky Derby, 1970. This is the prime example for talking about Gonzo, as it's the first Gonzo article was about the Kentucky Derby in 1970. So here are the horses that won. Here are the people who own the horses. Here are the trainers of the horses. Here are the jockeys. Here are their numbers. Here is where they finished in the pole position. The first 5, I don't have all of the times. I just had the first time, so the others were blank, so I figured why even put them on here. This is traditional sports journalism. This is like basic. This is what you want to know. If you put money on a horse, or you're just interested in which horses won, this is it. This is the basic info that you would want to know. Contextualized, you know what it is. There you go. It's the top-down view of the Kentucky Derby and what happened. This is a quote from Hunter S. Thompson's article, "The Kentucky Derby is Decadent and Depraved," and I will try to read it here in his typical cadence. "The rest of the day blurs into madness. The rest of that night too. And the next day and night. Such horrible things occurred that I can't bring myself to even think about it now. Much less put them down in print. I was lucky to get out at all. One of my clearest memories of that vicious time is Ralph being attacked by one of my old friends in the billiard room of the Pendennis Club in downtown Louisville on Saturday night. The man had ripped his own shirt down to the waist before deciding that Ralph was after his wife. No blows were struck, but the emotional effects were massive." So as you can see, this has nothing to do with the Kentucky Derby. What he's talking about actually took place after the Kentucky Derby at a nightclub, around a billiards table, and it was a fight that the illustrator of the article almost got into. This is Gonzo, right? This is Gonzo. This is what Gonzo journalism is. It's a first person account of like what the experience of the event was like. It's actually, it's fueled by madness, but in and of itself, like, it's a really cool style of telling that story. Like, it's a really interesting way to talk about the Kentucky Derby. Like, the Kentucky Derby 1970, here are the horse stats, but, like, what was it like being there? Like, what were the people like? How drunk did they get? Like, what was the craziest thing that you saw at the Kentucky Derby? Like, that's what people want to know. If you tell somebody, it's like, I was at the Kentucky Derby in 1970, they want to say, it was like, oh, what was the craziest hat you saw? What was the coolest dress you saw? What was the craziest thing you saw that happened? Like, did anything crazy happen in the stands? Like, what were people like back then? What were people's mustaches like back then? Like, that's what you want to know. When somebody tells you they were at an event like that, when somebody tells you they were at, like, Woodstock, you want a first-person account. You don't want to know, like, oh, what was the exact band lineup? What times did they start? Who went on? It's like, that's like, no, you don't care. Like, what songs did they play? Like, that's all secondary information. Like, buy the album if you want to know that. But you want to know what the experience was like to really, really be there. So let's look at that in game design terms. This is the Kentucky Derby racing game, made in 1970, 4 years before tabletop role-playing games were invented. And it is pretty much what you would expect from a board game. It was made by Whitman Games, published by Western Publishing. The rules of play are pretty simple. All the you're up to 7 players can play. You pick a number between 1 and 7. You pick a horse, and then you spin the spinner when it's your turn. And if the spinner comes up with the same color as your horse, you move that horse forward. But if it's another color, you move that color horse forward. So that's kind of interesting. And then if it comes up as in the white color, you skip your turn, which I guess kind of messes with the action economy a little bit of this game, but otherwise, like, it really has no effect on the outcome of the game, whether it's your turn or not. And that's That's what I love about these games. Like, you can play Candyland against yourself and lose. Like, that's the best part about these stupid old games, is they're so, like, why would you ever want to play this game? At least to me, like, that's what I think. Like, Monopoly is, at least because of the crazy deals and stuff you can make, Monopoly becomes a very interesting game. And that is a Gonzo mechanic, right? It gives the players the ability to start making some rules and to start crafting a narrative. So let's move on here to contemporary role-playing game design. This is I'm looking at the Kentucky Derby now through the lens of a role-playing game from the year 1980 called Call of Cthulhu that's still popular today. I chose Call of Cthulhu because in my mind it is the most likely game in which you would encounter the Kentucky Derby. It just seems like it's a very natural fit. Players begin play at the Kentucky Derby in the year 1970. They are all there for their own reasons, gambling addictions, family obligations, or just for the revelry. As the winning horse crosses the finish line, a prominent business magnate stumbles and falls to their death. Each of the PCs either see this happen directly or witnesses some shady figures murmuring in a circle near one of the stairwells during the event. The grandstand stairwells, I should say. The players are brought into police custody that night to share their side of the story. So, this is a typical setup for a Call of Cthulhu adventure, to be completely honest. It's pretty par for the course. I had to stop playing Call of Cthulhu because it's a lot of the adventures are very, like, they follow the same literary tropes of, like, just a small number of authors, so who are all inspired by the same author, and so it's all very samey. And if you're a player who has run the game a bunch of times and read a bunch of modules, then I played at Free RPG Day one year. I played a Call of Cthulhu thing called the Derelict, which I'd never run any modern or read any modern Call of Cthulhu anything, but the judge, or the keeper, I should say, clearly thought that I had read the adventure before, and was like trying to catch me out on having known it. But really, I was just like, I couldn't help but be a little meta. Like, I know the beats. I know, like, the story beats and how this traditionally works. And so, unless you're really, like, turning the whole thing on its head, but either that or I'm totally paranoid in Call of Cthulhu. But this is traditional setup. Like, all the players are there at the event. They all witness it happen. They have their own viewpoints. Maybe some saw the murmuring figures. Maybe some didn't. Maybe the rich people were all up in the boxes and just saw the dude stumble, but, like, it's the jazz musician guy who was, like, smoking reefer down by the stairwell, saw these murmuring dude, like, maybe they were wearing cloaks and had, like, a ceremonial dagger. They was, like, stabbing a doll that looked like a rich dude. Like, and no one believes him. Like, and so, but all the players now know about this, and they're like, ah, damn it, the cops aren't going to do anything about this. Like, we believe the jazz musician, so, like, now we got to investigate further. That's how the Kentucky Derby would be used in a role-playing game. And it creates a narrative that moves outside of the Kentucky Derby. Maybe goes beneath in the access tunnels beneath the Kentucky Derby, and to, like, how they connect to old sewer system and, like, a weird, like, catacombs beneath Louisville. Like, it's just, like, insane. Like, you know, who knows where it ends up going, but that's Gonzo. That's crazy. Here's another example. Dune. If you were going to run a Dune game, then you really have two choices, in my opinion, especially from an OSR perspective. You've got Dune, the 1979 war game, originally by I crapped out on it. I'm sorry. I don't remember who it's originally by, but now the reprint is by Gale Force 9. Please look into it. It is an excellent game. Gale Force 9 did not design this game. They're reprinting it. They designed the cards of the game, I guess, and the player tokens and all that stuff. But, like, it was all existed before that, and it is an excellent game. Pick it up. The Gale Force 9 version is great. There's tons of communities online. There's also like hacks of it. It's evolved into other games. It's got too long of a history to really go into. It's a beautiful game, but it is a war game, and each player does not control a character. Each player controls a faction from a top-down perspective. If you're the Harkonnen faction, you have some special Harkonnen abilities that help, support the narrative. But overall, you have a top-down view of all. You're controlling all the Harkonnen at once. You're not just controlling one character. On the flip side here, over Traveler, if you were going to run Dune as a role-playing game, just like that basic setting, like you want the players to go to Kaladin, you want them to go to Arrakis, you want them to go to like Gedi Prime, you want them to go everywhere. You Butlerian Jihad, like the whole thing. You want to do it all. You got to use Traveler then, because Traveler is going to give you the ability to go anywhere in that setting and do whatever you want to do with that setting and tell the narrative you want to tell. Dune, the board game, is only really going to give you the ability to tell the story of one conflict. You can tell that story a bunch of different times in a bunch of different ways, and it can get played differently, but it's always going to be the same conflict, that base core conflict in the novel Dune by Frank Herbert. And so it's originally called Frank Herbert's Dune, was the name of the game, and it's really apropos, especially if it was being printed in a time when the movie was coming out, because the movie is so different in a lot of ways. But this, they're both good games. They're both genius game design, and they're both heavily inspired by wargaming. Traveler, particularly by naval combat games. But they differed greatly in that in this game, all of the soldiers are just their little plastic pieces. But in Traveler, all of the soldiers are like, you can roll out their whole backstory, and they're people with hopes and dreams and stuff. It's like, it's creepy. And it adds a more human element, and it gives you more freedom not only as a game master, but as a player to craft a narrative around something specific. So, Gonzo journalism defined. At its simplest, Gonzo journalism can be defined as a subjective form of nonfiction storytelling featuring a narrator who is also a protagonist, a player. This is actually from Baker, Totally Gonzo's an article about Gonzo journalism. But Gonzo, as it is in game design terms, overarching, all tabletop role-playing games are Gonzo, because they allow the player to take a first-person narrative perspective, like to say that, all role-playing games are Gonzo. So what do people mean when they're talking about that? But at its core basic definition, all tabletop games are Gonzo, since the players they're taking a much more active role in crafting the story, and they serve as one of many narrators, right? Fantasy role-playing games are Gonzo on the game design spectrum, as opposed to war games like Dune that see the player as controlling entire factions working within predefined hierarchies. So an interesting take on this could be like a game in which every round of Dune the war game is then played out as a session of Dune as a Traveler game, which could be a really excellent marriage of the Gonzo elements and the just basic mechanical design elements that don't allow for the player to really be a narrator, that just to make choices, really. And it's a cool way, it's a cool thought process. I went back. I don't know how I did that. So, what do people mean when they say an RPG or an RPG setting or just a rule in particular is Gonzo? This is a difficult question to answer at this point, since we've come to the conclusion now that all RPGs, in one way or the other, is a Gonzo thing. So this question has 3 answers, each with its own caveats. So I want to elaborate on them individually. The first one is hyperbole. and redundancy. These it's just since all RPGs are Gonzo, if you say something's Gonzo, you might just be exaggerating. You might also just mean like crazy or over the top or exaggerated. And I think it's better to like use those terms rather than Gonzo because the meaning of what Gonzo really is has been very muddled. And so I think we need to like create more solid definitions. So the second way is a much more solid definition, and it's the aesthetic ideals of a role-playing game. So the American series, the American Survival Guide, its source books, and Crawling Under a Broken Moon zine is a hack for DCC that touts itself as a Gonzo post-apocalyptic campaign setting. This is true. I have no problem with this whatsoever because it's Gonzo as hell. It's very Hunter S. Thompson, American, like acid-fueled nightmare version of the American dream, but in a post-apocalyptic setting. If that's your bag, if that sounds cool to you, then this is a game for you. This is like, it's just a great way to elevator pitch this style of game. And this game contains rules that I would personally describe as Gonzo. And that's actually a great segue into my new proposed definition for Gonzo as it relates to role-playing games, specifically within the OSR. In terms of role-playing games, Gonzo defines game mechanics as In terms of role-playing games, Gonzo defines game mechanics that add both a variable numerical or structural benefit / detriment to the players while simultaneously acting to preserve the overall verisimilitude of the game setting. So what the crap am I talking about here? I'm talking about telling a story in a role-playing game without having a character sitting at a table in a tavern telling a story to the players. Telling a story through game rules, mechanics, and encounters. That's really at the heart of what the OSR is all about. And so any rules that support that are Gonzo. Any rules that support what makes role-playing games what they are and how they are unique is, to me, Gonzo. It's a melding of fluff and crunch. A random encounter table in D&D is Gonzo because it allows you to explore that story further. So, example here. There is a forest. It's the Black Forest, which is called the Black Forest. I know it's a real place, but whatever. And in the Black Forest, hippogriffs and bugbears have been battling each other for quite some time. They've been coming to blows for their own various reasons. And as a dungeon master, you could do two things here. One of two things in this example. The first is you have a guy in the tavern tell the players, watch out for them black woods out there. There's a bunch of bugbears and hippogriffs got into a battle with each other and they're fighting, and it can be pretty dangerous. Which is fine. Or you could have like a sign that says like, don't go in these woods, except the sign's like fallen and like grass is overgrown. And as they go into the woods, they have to roll on a random encounter table. The random encounter table is populated by bugbears, hippogriffs, and either the aftermath of a battle between bugbears and hippogriffs, or a little less commonly, a battle between bugbears and hippogriffs that's already in progress. So that to me is Gonzo because it puts the players in the action potentially. It allows the players to figure this out for themselves, put it through their own character's lens, allow their character to decide how their character would respond to this stuff, and then move on. Rather than just like a dude warning them not to go into the woods, and the players are like, all right, we're not even going to go in there. What if the players are like, it'd be way quicker if we just cut through these woods. Let's just cut through these woods. And then they find out, oh no, This woods is a battleground between bugbears and hippogriffs. This is terrible. Why did we come in here? We've been hearing shrieks and wails echoing through the forest the entire time. We keep seeing shadows flying about us. There's bugbears that have been attacking us. There's a hippogriff. Like, what's going on? Like, that's a much better session. That's a much more unique and interesting session. So another way that another example I give here is the random undead in the Dungeon Crawl Classics core rulebook. So in the Dungeon Crawl Classics core rulebook, all undead are given this table in which you can roll kind of like a fluff feature, like, oh, they're wrapped in like jangling chains, or they're like a basic like sheet ghost, or they look exactly like they did when they died. Just, you know, some random little fluff about the undead. And then you also roll on a table that tells you a little feature about them. That can be something like, oh, they have like they can grasp you and like drain your hit points or drain your experience points, or like they can shoot lightning bolts, or, you know, just some random undead thing, something fluffy, the description of the undead, how it looks, and something crunchy, a new special ability for that undead to unleash onto the players. That's Gonzo. It's Gonzo because it adds a bit of depth, a bit of believability, and a bit of like, it's more than just like, it's a skeleton. And it's a little bit crazy too. It can be a little bit crazy. So that, I would say, is Gonzo. Dungeon Dressings from Stonehell is a singular table that combines the best of both fluff and crunch by adding some random dungeon dressings that you could put anywhere that both enforce the narrative behind the Dungeon of Stonehell, but could also potentially give the players some unique equipment to work with. So, okay, they run into some manacles like chained onto the wall. How many feet of chain is that? Is it like 5 or 10 feet of chain? That's pretty good. One of the players in our party is a metal worker. Let's just, like, you know, add that to the chain that we've got. We've got a little bit of rusty chain. We got some more rusty chain. We're getting a bunch of chain here. Maybe this will come in useful. This will become useful for us at some point. In a dungeon like Stonehell, it almost certainly will. So that's the beauty of OSR. That's the beauty of these games, is the player has control. So one other thing is, random weather systems are, I would say, inherently Gonzo, especially when you have them a bit customized for certain climates. That's when they're the most Gonzo. When you reinforce that it rains a lot here, or like, this is a desert, it never rains here. Like, that kind of stuff is really important in role-playing games, especially in like sandbox games, where it's not so easy to just put an expositionary NPC. Especially in OSRs, that's not very old school, to have an NPC that's going to just stand there and explain the whole thing to you. You might have an NPC who knows how to get to like level 3 of the dungeon in Stonehell and is trying to do this specific thing, and will almost certainly die without assistance. That's a great NPC. That's an excellent NPC in OSR, but it's not going to be like an NPC who's going to be able to tell you all the secrets about this dungeon and like everything you'd want to know. You know, you're not going to get that from OSR. So let's move on here. I also feel that it can be a replacement for a phrase that is not often used. It is a phrase that I think is maybe even overused in terms in video games, but I never hear it in terms of role-playing games, but it absolutely exists. It's ludonarrative dissonance. And in a video game sense, I'll just talk about this real quick. It's a conflict between a video game's narrative as told through the story and the narrative as told through the gameplay. Example. The original example from a 2007 blog post by Clint Hawking, Grand Theft Auto 4 is a beautiful story about Nico Bellic, a man of Eastern European descent who is kind of traveling to Liberty City to escape a life of violence that has been forced on him by unfair circumstances, only to discover this so-called land of the free is actually chock full of unfair circumstances that are going to force him to become violent. And it's a very interesting narrative. If you play the game like that character would, I guess. But if you're like anybody who plays Grand Theft Auto, to like burn off some steam every now and again, you might also be taking some side missions down just a crowded street in a taxi cab that you stole from somebody really violently, and then you might get into a shootout with the cops and blow up their cop cars by shooting the gas tanks, and then they explode, and there's just like a cascade of explosions that you've caused just because the dude at the hot dog stand, like the hot dog stand closed like as you were walking up to it, and it was like you just needed to heal, and now you had to go all the way to ammunition just to get an armor pack, and then so it's just like you just wanted to save the game, and now you've saved the game, and you're pissed. That is ludonarrative dissonance. That is not what Nico Bellic would do. You see what I'm saying? Like, that creates ludonarrative dissonance, and the same thing can happen in gameplay with murder hobos, with tons of different reasons. So the definition of ludonarrative dissonance implies that it also applies to tabletop role-playing games, since all video games in one way or another are based on tabletop role-playing games, as long as they aren't like sports games. But even then, some of the stats, it's just the way it works. Since this implied game design concept closely, so it implies that ludonarrative harmony also exists, right? Ludonarrative dissonance is when the mechanics and the story, something's wrong here. Ludonarrative harmony is when the mechanics of a game mesh in a way that they mesh with the story in a way that reinforces the believability of the shared experience of role-playing games. So I propose that we adopt Gonzo as a way of describing when game rules support a game's narrative, especially the player's role within crafting that narrative, which does open up Gonzo for a lot more definitions within the world of role-playing games than just OSR games. And that is also by design. I think that, we don't get into this yet. I think that all role-playing games are inherently Gonzo. And so we can all kind of like come together in that fact that we're all Gonzo a little bit. Either the story gamers, the OSR gamers, the whole thing. So I'm gonna wrap this up real quick by ruffling some feathers by using some literary examples, both from Appendix N, which is the list of books and novels and novellas and pulp stories that inspired Dungeons and Dragons, the initial editions. So this is one example that I would describe as not particularly very Gonzo-esque. It's slick. The characters have some basic fantasy fairy tale chivalrous motivations. And it doesn't lend itself particularly to a roleplay setting due to the lack of descriptive text, and also the fact that it relies on the narrator's or the reader's understanding of the modern world through a fantasy lens of fantasy tropes. It's like, what if Europe was a fantasy realm? And it's very much like you see the map and you're like, oh, it's Europe. And the reason I think is they hide the map in the first book, and you realize it's Europe, and it's kind of like this really cool experience, which is awesome. Honestly, I love the Hawkmoon saga, all 4 books. I've got them. I've been reading them. I try to go to the park every couple weeks and read a few chapters, because it's just like it's a really good read. And you gotta get out in the park every now and again. It's a great read. I highly recommend them. I wouldn't particularly describe it as Gonzo, and I wouldn't particularly think would make a great fantasy setting. It would be a great inspiration for your fantasy setting, but in and of itself, I don't think it would make a good place to really adventure without a lot more work from the judge or dungeon master to flesh it out a lot more. as it relates to things that aren't pertinent to the story of Dorian Hawkmoon. Now, a literary example I would say is absolutely Gonzo. Or at least Gonzo-esque. Is Lord of the Rings. Yes, it's verbose, and the characters have highly complex, mythic, fairy tale, fantasy motivations, with the exception of some of the hobbits. They have very simple, like, human motivations, and they are all the hobbits are... How do I say this properly? The hobbits are our portal, our viewpoint into the world of Lord of the Rings, in the world of Middle-earth as the viewer or the reader of the Lord of the Rings stories. Lord of the Rings inspired the creation of countless D&D settings with its deeply descriptive text. The fact that J.R.R. Tolkien describes every little shadow, every little tree branch, and every little tree and bush and shrub and weird thing that grows here, every healing herb, and every weird glance and poem that somebody's reading or reciting or whatever, so much of that is informed by stuff that he knows back here. Like, there's a whole world that was like in J.R.R. Tolkien's mind that he was just like giving us a view into, and like he wanted a world for this grand mythology to exist within. Like, he had a top-down view, and he was giving us the first-person Gonzo perspective of this story, where I would say, and it also, so it creates an understanding of the fantasy world by immersing the reader in details informed by an existing, fully fleshed out mythos. That's what I mean by that. And this is still great. This is still excellent. I just don't think it's particularly Gonzo. The Eternal Champion saga, the Elric of Melniboné books, I would say are a little more, probably a lot more Gonzo, especially because it has like a fully fleshed out like fantasy world and some fantasy cultures and stuff. It's very, very cool. But I think that this is some really good discussions in general. Like, what do you think about all of this? What are your thoughts? Share them in the comment section. Share them in the chat. Have you thought about ludonarrative dissonance / harmony as it relates to role-playing games before? What role-playing games or rules would you describe as Gonzo? Also, what books, films, TV shows would you describe as Gonzo as well? I'm very interested. I want to talk more about this, and I'm very interested in doing a follow-up video on this if enough of you respond and kind of like we can start a conversation going here a little bit. Thank you all so much for watching. I've been Judge Zed, aka Zach Lane. You already know the drill. Give me a like, follow, subscribe. Give me a follow on Twitch. If you want to see more interesting content from me, if you want to see some of my RPG streams, stick around. I've got some really exciting news that I'm going to go over here in another video coming out on YouTube tomorrow, coming live on Twitch right now. I will see you all real soon. Thank you for watching.